Oliver, thank you very much for joining us today. I want to, first things first, just go back to a younger you, shall we say. Let's say I'm going back and talking to Oliver, age 12, and saying to him, just to let you know, in the future, you're going to be associate editor and one of the hot shots at one of the biggest publications in the country and arguably the world. What would your reaction to that be?
I think I probably would have settled for that. Going back to that age, what I always wanted to do was write, which, it's probably not the way to approach journalism, really, in that writing is the final 20% of what we do. And actually the real sort of craft of journalism, whether it's columns or features or news, is the reporting, the understanding stuff, speaking to people, interviewing, reading the background, getting the color, all that kind of stuff. But what I loved at that age was sort of reading, writing, all that side of stuff. And that's where my first love of the word came from.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we'll obviously dive into your career as we go throughout the podcast. But just intrigued, at that age, was it specifically business that you were looking at, or was business just happened to be kind of the outlet that you chose to write about?
No, I was definitely not too fussed about business age 12. I would say post-university, looking for journalism jobs, stuff came up on financial magazines, and I wasn't really too bothered about it. I think, like a lot of people that aspire to be journalists, you sort of think you're going to do Watergate straight away and be a sort of big political journalist the minute you graduate. But you need to get a sort of foot in the door somehow. And starting out at a small trade mag, I sort of learned the ropes there. And actually, the more you get into it, the more you realize how exciting it can be, because you get huge numbers, big money's at stake, you get big egos sometimes, huge companies everyone knows, they tend to be global. You've got the political element too, big stories like SoftBank Arm or Cadbury Craft. They have huge numbers attached, big drama, lots of color. So it becomes a great vehicle for all kinds of journalism, and you can tell a lot of stories via business. I think you can tell social stories, political stories, people stories. So it's a great canvas to work with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What would you have chosen at age 12 to write about?
Still going back to the 12-year-old me. To be really honest, I always loved fiction. So I probably would have dreamed of being a novelist one day, which may still happen one day. And that was what I read, definitely at that age. So it would have been, I can't remember what it exactly was, aged 12, but I was always a big reader of fiction, and less so these days. I spend a lot of time reading, journalism, long form, in terms of books, but still enjoy a good novel. And that's what I started out with.
Yeah, no, excellent. And we will get onto your own writing exploits a little bit later on, but let's move off the age 12 topic, shall we? Let's go into kind of a bit of an overview of your career. Obviously, we know where you've ended up, but tell us a little bit about the stops along the way.
Well, I graduated in 2005 with a degree in English, and worked for a small newswire in Canary Wharf for a little while. Then went to Trade Mag, I mentioned, Money Management, which is part of the FT business stable. Then went to Investment Advisor, which was their sister publication. Then did a postgrad at City University in journalism, newspapers, and from then City AM, and then Sunday Times. But it was a great fun journey, and I really enjoyed the early stages. Being Trade Mag's City AM, scrapping for stories. Learning the craft, reading everything you could, trying to meet everyone you could. In some ways, the early days are very exciting because you don't know what's going to happen, and it's all to play for, and you've got to sort of claw your way up and try and get onto a national paper. And that stage was a lot of fun. But I arrived at the Sunday Times age 26, so I was still fairly young. Started out covering commercial property there, then retail correspondent where I met Philip Green, then city editor, then biz editor, then now associate editor. So time has gone by pretty quickly, even though it's been a little while now since I graduated.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, again, just kind of sticking on the theme of, kind of, we know why you got into the business. You kind of mentioned that, or the business side of things. But what was your kind of relationship with business before? Did you have any kind of entrepreneurial people around you, maybe growing up? Was there, what was that kind of background like when you were younger?
Yeah, not really entrepreneurial. My dad worked for Barclays for many years, so I sort of occasionally heard his stories of work. Um, Not really. I suppose I would have been 16 in the year 2000, so the Blair era I still remember very strongly. And I think back then you had a government with a much more pro-business agenda, a much bigger relationship with business, and you had UK companies going out doing big deals. You know, BP bought Amoco, M&S was going to the US. You had, I think, an era of British business being very sort of lively and colourful, which you would sort of read about in the press and things, and plus a government that was pretty pro-business. You know, Peter Mandelson saying he was intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich, brackets, provided they pay their taxes, and I think that was the sort of backdrop. And then I left uni in 2005. We had 2 more years of that really crazy bull market before the credit crunch happened, and then the financial crisis. So, and then I was at City during the financial crisis doing my postgrad. So again, that sort of formative time of being a student of journalism while all those huge world events are erupting around you, it's quite inspiring, and it gives you a sense of actually when things really get interesting. This is how big stories can be. These are how epoch-defining money and business and finance can be to world events, world politics, people's lives. The downturn we had in 2009, 2010, recession caused by too much debt, the subprime meltdown, the banking crisis. So I think I was quite lucky to have certain periods of my life where it coincided with business, politics, current affairs being very front and center in national life, and then that gives you a sense of this is what I can do with these stories. If you get yourself in the right place and you meet the right people and you do journalism the right way, this is how exciting and engaging it can be.
Yeah, because I mean, again, following that kind of train of timeline, you straight into Brexit, and then we've obviously had a little bit of turbulence since then, and then COVID. I mean, it's been quite an interesting career you've got there. I'm sure there's some journalists maybe a little bit older than you that didn't have as much interesting time kind of going up, but kind of let's go back to those kind of key times and kind of Brexit with everything that was kind of swirling around, and that obviously gives you plenty of content, but like you said, there's a hell of a lot of political turmoil around that. Kind of covering that, if you reflect on it all these years later, how do you feel about that time in British history? Do you kind of reflect on it a little bit and be like, wow, there was a lot of misinformation, and we could have done better as far as politicians kind of letting us know all of the facts, or how do you reflect on that time?
Yeah, I agree with all that. I mean, I was retail correspondent back then, so I had limited input into what the paper thought about Brexit or wrote. I didn't have the column back then. I was a reporter, so I had limited input into what the paper would have said. And as a writer, actually limited input because retail had its issues around shipping and supply chains, access to labour, those kind of points, but not really as crucial to the Brexit debate as, say, the car making industry or financial services. So, looking back, the Sunday Times was pro-Brexit. I didn't have any opportunity to influence that back then. I think it probably came a bit too soon, as a bit too early in my career as an event for me to have any real sway in the debate. But I think you're right. There was lots of misinformation. With hindsight, would it have been better for the mainstream media to have been stronger about it? Potentially. I think quite a few people, not singling out any individual publication, but tried to be very balanced and tried to put both sides. And then there was a bit of false equivalence around promoting arguments equally when one side was a lot stronger than the other. So there's a bit of that, I think, looking back.
Yeah, no, definitely. And again, keeping along that same timeline, only a few years later, you were As you mentioned, getting close to Sir Philip Green, and you ended up a few years later actually writing a book about it, Damaged Goods: The Inside Story of Sir Philip Green. I mean, give us a little bit of an idea of kind of how things were then, because you're building this relationship with this man, but even the reviews that he's said about your book are absolutely hilarious. But that must have been a really, really pivotal kind of time dealing with such a big character. And obviously, writing a book as you did, that must have been, an interesting period of your life, that's for sure.
Yeah, it was. It was a great story. And it kind of goes to the heart of how the Sunday Times tries to do journalism, which is tell big macro stories through people and draw out the personal drama and the human colour. And you think about the Philip Green story, really, if you're going to get techie about it, it's a story of high street collapse, that structural shift from physical to online, and the huge disruption that caused. And Arcadia, Topshop, all his brands, they were right at the center of all that because he'd been so committed to stores and so skeptical about digital for so long. So that's the kind of industry backdrop, and it was a way of telling that story about this destruction of the high street and the way these dinosaur, once powerful brands were swept away. But then you had this really compelling figure at the heart of it all, sort of market trader wit, hugely funny and forceful personality, very certain that he was always right. And we sort of met when I first became retail correspondent. It must have been around 2012, 2013. And we had a brief honeymoon where he sort of took me under his wing and introduced me to various people and connected me in the retail world. And the Sunday Times was his favorite newspaper, so he had a special place for it and vice versa. And it started to unravel when he sold BHS for £1 in 2015. And BHS was the worst part of that high street empire he had. It was really losing money year after year, being propped up by Philip Green and Arcadia, big pension deficit, which he was keen to get rid of. And he sold it for £1 to a unsuitable guy, Dominic Chappelle, who's now in jail. And the story started there, and we started investigating and pulling at the string, and it unraveled. We had lots and lots of funny interactions, but if I pick just one that gives you a sense of what he's like as a guy, we were arguing once, and went round and round and round, and he stopped and said, "Oliver, I wouldn't threaten you." And I said, "Philip, you've just threatened to throw me through an effing window." And he said, "You're the kind of gentleman I think likes to live on the edge. There's a small difference between edge and ledge, and that's all you've got to remember." And very good with those kind of one-liners, which alternating between that kind of thing and being quite threatening is quite effective as a negotiating tool. And he's someone who really was outmoded as the whole algorithmic trading thing came along, and Boohoo and ASOS maximized tech and early AI and that side of things. But he was a great example of someone who lived on his wits and thought about things in a very old-fashioned human way. And we forget now, for years, those kind of people dominated the business world, didn't they? People who had it in their heads and could do things on gut instinct.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm quite intrigued to get your thoughts on things, because obviously Philip Green is known for being, like you said, a very big personality. There's still people around now that are very vocal. Elon Musk is the one that comes to mind the most, but it feels like there is a bit of a shift in kind of high level leadership to kind of just getting on with the job, not really making yourself a big almost target for various things. Have you noticed kind of even in your tenure, in journalism, that there's almost a toning down in business as far as those big brash personalities?
Yeah, definitely. I think that they're less acceptable in general across a whole range of things, because that kind of behavior tends to go along with other things, doesn't it? A more lax workplace culture, and everyone's so conscious now about being inclusive and transparency, but behaving in a certain way the whole time at work, rightly so. So there's been, I think, a generation of CEOs come through who are much much lower ego, more collegiate, more emollient in their style. You look at Charlie Nunn at Lloyd's, or Jakob Stausholm at Rio Tinto. These people running big organizations now are pretty low profile, low ego, and the sort of cult of the individual is definitely on the wane. You're right to point out that it still survives very strongly in tech, and I think you get these people where you get a bull market because you can get away with more in a bull market, and also bull market attracts these kind of characters and entrepreneurs. So currently it's tech. Before that there was mining, Ivan Glazenberg and Tom Albanese and these kind of characters. And before that we've had various cycles, retail in the 90s, Philip Green, media, Martin Sorrell. You do get these kind of larger than life figures with very compelling stories, but they tend to come through, I think, in a bull cycle. So tech now, and also you're right, in general, in corporate PLC world, it's very hard to get away with that now. So where you do get them, it's either big companies where they're run like private fiefdoms like Facebook, like Tesla, or it's in the private world, unlisted venture capital. So we do get fewer of them, and it's probably in general better for staff, but worse for journalists, because these kind of people make great stories, and they're great vehicles to tell stories through, and they're full of color. And people like Philip Green, always admire that he never went through PR people. He was always direct to the journalist, and we know that's risky in many occasions, but it makes for more exciting copy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm also intrigued about kind of, a massive part of your job is those relationships. And, I'm sure you would have developed over time quite a good antenna for effectively what's bullshit and what's real. How do you how quickly can you kind of meet with someone and be like, this person is actually a real deal, we need to watch this person, versus there's just hot air behind this individual, let's keep them a little bit at arm's length?
I think you can always tell quite quickly, can't you? I think it's not unique to me. I think most of us probably have a pretty good sense within half an hour meeting someone what they're like. I suppose the difference in the business and political worlds is people often have a lot of cheerleaders around them, and they can pay, to a degree, and buy that stuff in via PR and comms and lobbying. And so, you often get people where there's a lot of noise around them, which slightly obscures your judgment, or, sometimes you can aim off a bit when you're right in the first place because you hear a lot about someone. So sometimes it's more about knowing when to trust your judgment rather than actually having the judgment in the first place, if that makes sense. I think we all generally can sniff these things quite well. It's just a case of sometimes cutting through the noise and relying on your own judgment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, kind of piggybacking on that same relationship kind of thread, you must have been around some absolutely exceptional leaders, and I'm sure you have plenty of stories that you've kind of covered over the years of that real exceptional leadership and kind of figures particularly doing incredible things. Do any kind of stick in mind, any that kind of go like, people and business leaders need to be more X?
Yeah, you can cut it a few different ways, can you? There are people you meet. It's a privileged job. You get to meet some very interesting people, and some of the sheer IQ you meet is really interesting. People like Stefano Pessina, the guy who did the Boots and Alliance merger and then sold the whole thing into Walgreens. Super bright guy, very long term, huge vision, a big contrarian. Daniel Kretinsky, the Czech Sphinx with stakes in Sainsbury's and Royal Mail, we interviewed at the weekend. Really bright, engaging guy. Again, a big contrarian. People like Bruce Flatt at Brookfield, Steve Schwarzman at Blackstone, visionaries who reshaped financial services. But you meet a whole range of interesting people. We saw Deborah Crew, the new boss of Diageo, this morning. Very personable. Great backstory there. Started off in the US military, now runs a huge consumer goods company. It's honestly really hard to pick a few because you meet so many, and you meet people who impress you in different kinds of ways. You can meet people who have great interpersonal leadership thing and are very good at relating. You meet great communicators. You meet people who are really into the detail, know their industry. You meet people who are sort of super bright on the financing side and financial engineering. You meet people who have the ability to cut across, receive wisdom and be contrarian and read the way things are going to go. So yeah, there's a whole spectrum, and it's very interesting. And you meet certain CEOs who are right for their time as well. You meet CEOs who their style works in a certain period, and then the mood changes, and that kind of thing doesn't really work anymore. You meet CEOs who are, at least in recent past, very, very shareholder focused, very, very financial performance focused, and I think these days you have to have a few more strings to your bow in terms of stakeholders and society, and showing you have a broader awareness. I mean, someone like JS Jack, the former Rio Tinto CEO, is very popular among shareholders for many years, delivered very good results, and then had that disaster blowing up the Juukan Gorge Aboriginal caves in Western Australia, and blew up his own career and the careers of several others at Rio in the process. And that's a very good example of something where the S in ESG came to the fore, and suddenly when you get a crisis like that, it can matter more than all the performance. So I think certain CEOs have different angles to their personality and skill sets, and it's very rarely you meet someone who can do all.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And sticking along that theme of ESG, actually, you get people such as, Jordan Peterson, who are very, very critical of ESG, not necessarily of the idea of it, but more of the execution, the greenwashing, and that's very much a focus that he's kind of very vocal on. Yourself, obviously, throughout your career, there's been more of an importance, I would say, maybe in the last few years, especially on the ESG kind of agenda. But how are you kind of finding it on the ground? As far as people in business, are people still relatively, positive about it behind the scenes? Because our experience is that sometimes you do get a lot of people who public facing tend to be very much like ESG 100%, it's good, and then behind the scenes they just go, it's actually a bit of a pain, it's just a bit of a money wasting exercise. What have you kind of noticed with that?
Yeah, that tallies with what I pick up. I think to your point about Jordan Peterson, people don't tend to argue with the underlying aims of ESG. Like, no one wants, or very few people want, more pollution, worse societal outcomes, worse governed companies. But I think it's the way it's applied that's come to alienate people. And you get PLCs with 20 big shareholders all asking for slightly different interpretations of what ESG is. You still have no agreed real metrics around it, even 10 years or however many years after it first came into being. You have a lot of siloing, so people only looking at one particular thing in an organization, or even hiving off ESG into being an ESG director or an ESG part of the annual report. And my personal beef with it is that it's become quite reductive and quite box ticking, and often doesn't really solve what it says it will. So big energy company sells off its coal mines and says, right, we're now an ESG friendly stock. And it's like, well, in a very narrow sense, you've cleaned up your emissions, but the emissions are still there. In fact, they're probably going to get worse because you've now sold them to some private equity firm who's going to run those coal assets harder. So there's lots of sleights of hand, jiggery pokery, people running around like headless chickens trying to appease investor groups. And I think a lot of it has become either quite self-defeating or quite pointless. So my personal thing is companies should bake, good behavior into whatever they do, and it shouldn't be an extra or some sort of separate category of thing you have to think about. You shouldn't have to have a ESG section of your board meeting or of your annual report, because whatever you do, you should be thinking, well, what's the balance between the financial impact of this and the societal impact? What's the reputational damage we might do by moving towards XYZ? It's all part of the same picture, isn't it? And you can't, I don't think, hive these things off into separate sections or solve them by, ticking things against a grid to meet certain requirements. And I think ESG as a sort of movement and as a way of doing things has become quite reductive, and probably has almost started to become irrelevant already, because a lot of companies now roll their eyes and say, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? So I think yeah, the investment community really needs to formulate some new way of looking at this, and so do companies.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And let's go back to the original timeline that we're kind of going across. The next big thing that really comes across that is the COVID pandemic. Now, let's go back to kind of March 2020. You know, obviously for yourself, there is definitely so much going on in the business world to cover, but also personally and as far as a publication, I'm sure there must have been a lot of kind of chaos behind the scenes trying to figure out the best way to do things. Just kind of take me back a little bit to that March 2020 and kind of your thinking and your mindset around that, and kind of, you know, getting the scoops that you normally get, but also kind of managing your own house. How was that experience for you?
Yeah, busy. Sunday papers in particular rely on getting out and seeing people and doing the reporting, and you know, we have the luxury of a week to produce stories in, but the flip side of that is you need to produce new stuff, and you can't just repeat what's out there in the daily papers. So you have to use that week to find exclusive new content, basically new stories, new angles, scoops. And when the whole world shuts down overnight, that part becomes a lot harder, although you do have the huge events, right? So you're robbed of your sort of bread and butter day-to-day stuff, but you do have earth-shaking events to get your teeth into. So you can do big, you know, 2-page spreads about gyrations in markets and, you know, potential nationalization of assets and, you know, airlines in crisis, furlough scheme being cooked up, companies being bailed out, B bills, C bills, all that kind of stuff. So it was a time of really big macro drama, not a lot of micro in terms of interactions, but the paper, you know, people sort of adapt to the new reality quickly, don't they? And we were all working at home for the first few weeks. We all had remote stuff to log in. It's very difficult putting together a physical product remotely because really being there with designers, looking at spreads, looking at pictures, headlines, that kind of stuff, still quite a sort of physical thing in the end, even if we are doing more and more digitally. Within a few weeks, I think it was, section heads were allowed to come back in. So the editor and people running sections were allowed to go back into the office, and even coming in and having my Pret and whatever it was, supermarket lunch, and just kind of having a routine felt like quite a luxury. You realize how lucky you are to have like freedom to go and do stuff. And I really hate being at home. I did the book at home, and 3 months of that was enough. I like being out and doing stuff and seeing people, and I think it gives you a nice sort of pattern to your day. And so the minute I could come back in, I was. Ditto our team actually on the business section. But it was quite a draining time, wasn't it? It was very uncertain. Everyone doing stuff via Zoom, which is quite tedious. And yeah, not seeing people for the usual meetings is it was challenging.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, you know, kind of reflecting again, you know, we have to talk about politics when it comes to COVID, you know, hindsight being 2020 and everything. But what was your kind of view 3 years later on how the government kind of handle things as far as furlough goes, and like you mentioned, C-bills and various kind of things that they put in place? How do you kind of reflect on that? Because it is a difficult job that they had, but how do you think they did?
The first lockdown, I suppose, was probably unavoidable in that the rest of the world was doing it, and we didn't understand what COVID was really, or when vaccines might arrive. Although you do look at Sweden and think, well, actually they had the sort of the bravery to go it alone. But first lockdown, you can kind of forgive, even if it was policed in a very excessive way. You know, what's come out since about Downing Street around Boris Johnson's not a surprise, is it? Although it is, you know, woeful the way that was being run. Furlough, I think, was, if you're going to have lockdown, you need to have some kind of job support scheme. So furlough was a good thing, and it probably saved the jobs market in terms of the bloodbath that could have happened. I think B bills, C bills, there was then too much pumped in beyond furlough, too much sort of liquidity from the government pumped into private markets. That definitely helped fuel inflation coming out of COVID. And I think the second and third lockdowns were a mistake, probably. We should have learned ways of doing things in the first lockdown, learned ways of moderating contact in case of a sort of lockdown light next time. But I thought the second and third lockdowns were mistakes, and the whole thing sort of went on far too long. And I think a lot of the pressures we're having now around inflation, work from home, city centres being not what they were, strange patterns of working, going out, that kind of stuff. It dates down to being locked down for too long, and I think it's look at the education system, the impact on kids, healthcare, the huge backlogs and operations. There's still a legacy we're working through from COVID, which has been very negative. So I think the whole thing went on too long and was, the government living hand to mouth, day to day, no plan, muddling through, being bounced around by scientists and pressure groups, and it was all a bit dysfunctional.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And obviously, as we sit here now, it's 3 years since the pandemic, the kind of beginning of it, that's for sure. But, if we go back to, again, that really turbulent time we had in 2008, some incredible businesses came out of that. You think of Uber, you think of Airbnb, and, 3 years later, we're already seeing some rather interesting changes that are coming quite quickly. And there's a few businesses that are really kind of stepping out of the shadow of what should be a very, very difficult time. Are there any kind of success stories that you're seeing at the moment that you just go, you know what, this business community is actually pretty incredible, the way that they've managed to, pivot and change things as quickly as they have?
Yeah, I think going back to something you said earlier, the pace of events has sped up since 2016, hasn't it? And think back to the great moderation of the New Labour years, or the early years of the Cameron coalition, and post 2016. It's been coming hard and fast, hasn't it? Political turmoil, then COVID, and now the other side of it, inflation and economic problems. I think it's funny, isn't it? The tech industry has gone through its bust in the past couple of years. Interest rates have risen, valuations have slumped, huge layoffs in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. I think the explosion of AI coming through, it's a point in time where it's post-pandemic, post-lockdown. Still got inflation roaring away. There's a huge amount of uncertainty, isn't there? And a lot could change in the next few years. But I just think we're only at the cusp of even glimpsing what AI is going to do to productivity and the menial tasks that are going to get outsourced to it in white-collar jobs, the research tasks, all the sort of admin stuff is quite amazing. And the speed it's happening at, people are concerned about job losses, aren't they? But I think, look at most innovation over history, it has pushed humans higher up the value chain, doing more interesting stuff, and AI will end up taking away some of the donkey work that underpins what we do. So I think there's huge opportunities there, and you'll see in journalism as much as anything else. You'll see people being able to do a lot more with their time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one of those things that is incredibly, quoted pretty much everywhere is that Goldman Sachs study that 300 million jobs are going to be replaced, which, it's an interesting time that we're heading into, because like you said, there's some people who are very, very cautious of it, very scared of it, but there's a lot of people who go, this is actually a great thing. When you think of historical precedent, you've got the Industrial Revolution, etc. But I mean, certain jobs that, we have now didn't exist 10 years ago. And, there's the Future of Work, Institute of the Future of Work, who say that 80% of the jobs that will be around in 10, 15 years' time don't exist today. So, we're going through an interesting time in history.
Yeah, I think, at least Western governments have shown during COVID they aren't going to let people just get thrown on the scrap heap in the way they might have been 20, 30 years ago. So even if you do get a huge disruption in a very short period of time and loads of white-collar job losses, which I think is quite unlikely, I think, things have changed, haven't they, with furlough, with COVID, with lockdowns, with the tax burden, with public services where they are. People aren't going to accept pain on the scale that previous tech disruptions might have brought. And I think you're going to see people nursed through into the new reality. And hopefully the other side, as you say, there'll be a lot more jobs created. But I mean, in journalism, it's going to be quite exciting, I think, because all the sort of tedious stuff that people did, well, still do now, some of the sort of stock market write-ups and the back-end research on things, the ability to outsource that quickly and gather huge amounts of information very quickly is going to be brilliant. And you think back to how even 20 years ago, you wanted to get everything a newspaper had written about whatever it was, drug legalization. You had to go into the physical library room attached to the newsroom, go through yellowing newspaper cuts, folder after folder after folder on different topics, and find the right one, bring it through. 2 hours of digging around probably for a junior, handed to the reporter, sort of 4 hours to go through it all. And now you use Factiva or whatever tool it is, and you can skim through every published word ever in sort of 10 seconds and find what you want. So I think we take for granted already how much easier our lives are based on tech in journalism. And the ability to sort of find phone numbers very easily, find old cuttings, find data, all that kind of stuff. It's saved a lot of time, and it's sort of made the job a lot more enjoyable in many ways because you can focus on what matters. So hopefully AI will do a similar thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely, 100%. And, just kind of final kind of thread on this, I guess, is kind of looking at that political side of things. You kind of mentioned the 2000 government and Lord Mandelson, for example, being very pro-business. How do you kind of see things now? And, there's a lot of political upheaval, and local election results are kind of, if that's anything to go by, we could look at a change of government in the next 12 months or so. How are you kind of seeing things on the political landscape? How much more does the government need to do to kind of help investment? When you think about the difficulty that the London Stock Exchange are going through, for example, a lot of companies delisting. How much political intervention should we be seeing? And do you think they're dropping the ball a little bit?
I think on the stock exchange, people have woken up to it. It's the old thing, isn't it, about gradually and suddenly it's reached that tipping point where people can't ignore it. I think there's no silver bullet on that, though, and it's not easy to see what any one government or group can do in the short term. There's cultural things underneath there as well, which is partly why companies are leaving to the US. I think more broadly, I've written about it a few times. If you think about competitiveness and government and business and what government should do, I don't think we can compete firepower. Well, we can't compete firepower-wise with the US. $370 billion of subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act. And we shouldn't be, sitting in a control room somewhere trying to pick every winner. But what you can do is set tram lines and try and create a fertile environment for things to grow in. And, having predictable taxes, not having windfall taxes, sorting out business rates. Those kind of things would help. Having better planning, quicker decision making, that would help as well. More stable regulation. There are certain things that the UK's got a lot of goodwill towards it, I think, and there are certain things any government could do to just create a more stable backdrop for companies to invest in. On the political front, I think, Brexit has been very bad for the Tories in all kinds of ways, hasn't it? But on business, it's really pulled them apart from that core constituency, and because so many big companies were opposed to leaving the EU. You've had the sort of infamous F-business policy under Boris Johnson, and that really has typified how the party or swathes of it have thought about business over the past 7 years. And Labour, you can see, have really stolen a march on the Tories and seen a lot of potential in wearing out the shoe leather, doing meetings, doing their smoked salmon offensive, as they call it. And they've made real inroads there. And I think they've gathered a lot of policy ideas from business, as well as reassuring business. So it's been quite fruitful for them. I think it's still all to play for next election-wise. I don't think the Tories have lost it yet by any means, and Labour haven't won it or sealed the deal yet by any means. But I think if you speak to most business people, they're pretty frustrated by the combination of sclerotic planning, no strategy on house building, taxes all over the place, general lack of interest in business, no coherent response to the Inflation Reduction Act or the European equivalent yet. It's a pretty confused picture, and I think Rishi Sunak does get it. He comes from that financial background in hedge funds. Jeremy Hunt is an entrepreneur, or formerly was, and he gets it as well. But it's several years of of huge damage to try and repair in a short space of time, and a cabinet of mixed abilities, and a cabinet slightly pointy in different directions.
It's now time for a very special segment. We've teamed up with the Jill Dando News Centre to bring you the Good News postcard. Oliver, today your question comes from Erica, aged 10.
Hi, my name is Erica, and I'm a student from St Anne's Academy. What is your favourite ever good news story?
Well, I'll ask you a journalist's favourite good news story. Thank you for that, Erica. Let me mull for a minute. Well, there was a guy recently. I'm quite interested in mentioning AI and tech and how it's changing things. And I think we didn't mention medicine and the advances it could help there. But there's a story recently about a guy who had some terrible spinal injury. Thought he wouldn't walk again. Doctors said he definitely wouldn't. There was no sign of recovery in months and years. And he's recently had some sort of device implanted where he can send brain signals to his legs again via some kind of AI transmitter. I admit you're catching me on the stump here, so I can't quite remember technical details, but basically he, within a few days of having this thing implanted, he was sort of moving his legs around, able to take tentative steps again, thanks to this technological breakthrough. And I think it's very exciting to think about what could happen in the next 10, 20 years if tech is used for the right things. If things like AI are applied more to medicine, what we could do. So I would choose that.
Absolutely. That's a great answer to a great question. That's for sure. Oliver, you've obviously, interviewed a lot of business leaders and entrepreneurs throughout your time. And, we are business leaders, so we have to ask, what to you makes a great business leader?
Leaving aside industry knowledge for a minute, because I think it helps if you have a real granular understanding of your business and if you can feel it in an entrepreneurial way, so you know the rhythm of how that sector works, the flows back and forth and the customers, all that kind of thing. But leaving that to one side, I think a clear vision is the starting point. So you have to have a clear understanding of the business, the industry you're working in, and where you want to go. And ideally within that, you sort of read where that industry is going to go over the next 5-10 years, and you try and position yourself in a way that you can take advantage of the trends that are coming towards you. And then I think the ability to communicate is underrated sometimes. But once you have that clear vision, can you communicate it internally in a way that engages staff or colleagues, as they're called now, and in a way that galvanizes the organization towards the very clear goals? And can you communicate it externally in a way that builds trust with stakeholders, lenders, investors, politicians, regulators, community groups? I think those two things over the years will be standout qualities I've seen in people. Can they have a clear vision and be very, very certain of where they're going? And two, can they then communicate that in a way that's effective to various people? And it sounds quite simple, just listing those two things. I think actually getting it working in harmony is very, very difficult. And being consistent and authentic, while also sort of managing through the nuances and slight roadblocks you're always going to hit, is quite hard. But I think those are two qualities I'd pick out of all the various leaders I've interviewed over the years as most of the standout guys, from sort of discount retailers to energy giants, have those in common.
Yeah, no, that's, again, a fantastic answer. Really appreciate that. And thank you so much for your time today, Oliver. Well, our final kind of question for you is, do you have any final words for our business leader audience?
I think we talked about the pandemic and recent challenges and Brexit and inflation and cost of living crisis and the fact these things have sped up in recent years. I think UK PLC in particular has shown itself to be very adaptable, very nimble, very resilient. And CEOs and founders and entrepreneurs and leaders have shown themselves to be very dynamic and flexible and able to cope with all manner of disruption and headwinds coming towards them. So I think it's to keep on channeling that, isn't it? And there's still plenty of goodwill towards the UK around the world. We can sometimes forget that in the UK, reading and in our case, writing a lot of fairly gloomy headlines about the state of the economy, state of politics, the health of consumers. But actually, you go around the world, everyone has their issues. I interviewed Bruce Flatt of Brookfield recently, the guy who built that big investment empire. And I asked him a similar question, and he said something like, you go to different countries around the world, everyone has their 5 complaints, and they all complain about them the whole time, and you're doing it here just like everyone else is. But if you put your head down and keep doing business and keep the faith, it'll all be fine. And that might sound a bit glib, but I think there's something in there. There's a natural positivity and energy to the UK business world, which is not to be betted against.